right. Good morning, afternoon, and evening, everyone, depending on what part of the world you are joining in for. Welcome to the last session for the day as a part of the research lens on advanced data sources. This particular panel will be focusing on future advancements and trends in multimodal data utilization. We will talk about different multimodal data sources, including patient registries, enhancing real world data through imaging, pathology, and omics data. Uh, Over last decade that I've spent in the field of real world evidence, I've seen data evolve from claims data to clinical data, which was structured EMR or lab data, to nodes, and then kept getting enriched through diagnostics data in form of pathology data, imaging data, omics data. Now there's a lot of patient-reported data, and all this together is what we call as multimodal data. Uh, Today, as a part of this panel, we have different individuals who are experts in different types of data sources, but also they'll be able to talk to us about how do we utilize and generate value out of these multimodal data sources, as well as technologies applied to derive this value out of multimodal data sources. Uh, to moderate this session, I would love to introduce the moderator and co-chair for the event, Janak Joshi. Janak currently serves as the Chief Digital Officer for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts under Governor Maura Healey. In his role, Janak is responsible for advancing digital and AI capabilities across state agencies and services. An accomplished entrepreneur in the Boston area, he was a part of the founding team at Synesthesia Technologies, Generation X, and Life Image. Life Image is now the largest global health exchange and imaging RWE company, serving 14 plus countries and over a billion patients. In addition to these roles, Janak has also served as an advisor to Walmart to launch Walmart Health. Over to you, Janak. Thank you so much for driving this session.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Just a thumbs up to make sure that you all can hear me okay. Fantastic. So really excited to lead this panel with some of my former colleagues, current colleagues, friends, and industry peers. We have all come to the realization that accessing data, especially EHR and claims data, over the years has become exponentially easier compared to, say, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago. Add the complexity of tokenization and multimodal data going beyond the claims data, as Pura was referring, has added a lot of complexities for the sponsors in terms of utilizing that data. So I will start off at least from top left. Stella, if you want to introduce yourself quickly, talk a little bit about the company, and once we kind of understand how each one of your organizations plays a role in the space, then we can dive a little bit deeper into the questions. So over to you, Stella.
Sure. Hi, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Stella Chang. I'm the Senior Vice President of Life Sciences at OMNY Health. So at OMNY, we are a research infrastructure company that has an extensive and growing network of healthcare organizations. These healthcare organizations will contribute to us their electronic health records as well as other patient data, and that all adds to our real-world data ecosystem. And this is an ecosystem that covers the entirety of the United States. The OMNY RWED network supports numerous retrospective studies, patient recruitment, and prospective data collection. And what we seek to do in our partnership with healthcare organizations such as hospitals, health systems, and specialty networks is that we're building this virtual cycle that delivers data and insights to our life sciences sponsors, to CROs and other healthcare stakeholders, while providing the opportunities for research engagement and insights back to the providers.
Fantastic. Jay, do you want to go next?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Jie W. I'm one of the co-founder and chief data officer at Segmed. So what we do is that we partner with healthcare providers in the US and also globally. We ingest their radiology imaging data and other data type into our central database, and we provide this data to life science companies, medical device companies, and other companies that need data. Our central core offering is imaging data, specifically radiology imaging data. We are heavily focused on the oncology, neurology, and cardiology space. And we have more than 100 million exams in our network from US and globally. We work with all sides of healthcare providers, from the largest nonprofit healthcare systems to the smaller radiology outpatient chains. And we are now starting to provide more multimodal data set, either through our collaboration or through our own network. So I'm very excited to discuss this a little bit more with all of you.
Fantastic. Eric, do you want to go next?
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. My name is Eric. I'm one of the founders and the CEO of Centaur Labs. Centaur is a company I started 5 or 6 years ago while I was doing my PhD at this place called the Center for Collective Intelligence at MIT. So I was interested in how do you leverage the collective intelligence of large groups of people and computers around the world to annotate data sets. And we have specialized in annotating data of all sorts, so video data, text data like clinical notes or scientific papers, and imaging data like radiology imaging data for companies specifically in the medical and life sciences who typically are trying to build artificial intelligence models. So the way that we do this a little differently, we have a large network of tens of thousands of doctors and medical students and specialists around the world who annotate data for our clients, but they are often competing with each other to prove that they're the most skilled and most accurate annotator at whatever it is that the client cares about. So that drives an incredible amount of scale, affordability, speed, and accuracy at the end of the day. So one way to think of us is if a company like Segmed is sort of an oil company drilling for oil and helping get it all out of the ground of the hospital systems, we're sort of the oil refinery here, who help structure and tag data in different ways for you to drive insights or build artificial intelligence algorithms.
Fantastic. Alice, would you like to go next?
Absolutely. It's a pleasure to be here and to be in this conversation with my fellow co-panelists. My name is Alice Kochinoff. I'm physician and chief medical officer at CuriMeta. And CuriMeta is a company that was started in 2020 really with this mission to develop and deliver multimodal data sets, curated and very bespoke for the specific need of our clients. We focus on collaborating with health systems and academic medical centers. Our founding data contributors are BJC Healthcare and Washington University School of Medicine in St. Louis. And in that multimodal approach, we're really looking at, of course, leveraging the electronic health record. We focus on the EHR data, linking that at the patient level with other areas of interest. So if you think about ancillary services, pathology, images and reports, radiology, digital images and reports, also omics, so that genetic information, the biomarker information, because we're seeing clearly and we're responding to a need to deliver complex data sets that are very specific for deep and complex use cases, focusing on precision medicine, maybe developing AI-enabled diagnostic prognostic models. We also very much focus on a deep collaboration with our data contributors who are part of a joint governance model that reviews and looks at and evaluates each of these use cases to make sure that we're using the data in a compliant and ethical manner.
Fantastic. And last but not the least, Dan.
So I'm Dan Poscover. I'm the CEO of Graticule. Graticule is a technology-enabled evidence and data CRO. And we run end-to-end studies in the US and Europe. We actually got kind of created out of Life Image and with Janik and started in the imaging data space. But what we learned was that sponsors want the right data for the right research question. And sometimes imaging is part of that. And in most times, they really just need access to clinical notes, radiology notes, pathology notes, which are sufficient to answer their questions. So we're really focused on providing the right information that they need to make their decisions, whether it's regulatory grade studies or non-regulatory grade studies. And excited to hear this panel and participate.
Fantastic. Thank you all. So what we have here is a collection of people who are responsible for aggregating data, cleaning the data, making the data accessible in a meaningful way, and folks like Dan and his company Graticule that lead end-to-end studies utilizing all of the above information from a validation studies and so on. So as the industry matures and the expectations with the FDA kind of matures in terms of safety indications, sensitivity, specificity, and accuracy and lineage of where the data is coming from, what the consents look like, etc. The question is, as buyers of multimodal data kind of continue to get more broader and deeper access to different varieties of data, some tokenized, some not tokenized, the onus of operationalizing and utility of the data is still on the sponsor. Now, do you all see a shifting market expectation for improving the efficiency behind consuming this data more as a fit for purpose? Because the observation and what I've been hearing in the industry is that I can access the data, but it still takes me 3 months, 6 months, sometimes even a year before which I can even use the data. So how are you all seeing the future of bridging that gap from access to utility and from utility to evidence? And Dan, it would be great to start with you, given you led off with the end-to-end studies, if you want to comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first step of it is data feasibility, which is we basically run a study to understand, is that data feasible for the research question? And this will include normalization, harmonization, possibly federating the data because most data can't move from place to place, and any type of annotation that is necessary. So it is a process that could take 3 months, I would say 6, 9 months, even a year to get to a point that the data is ready for consumption if it's not just a normal EHR data set, because it is a process. It is not going to happen overnight. And it's garbage in, garbage out. If you don't make that data ready for a study, then the output is not what the sponsor is looking for.
Now, when you think about, a 3 months or a 6 months or even a year lag in terms of utility of this data, obviously there is a cost component attributed to running and accessing RWE-led trials. So, with that in mind, Eric, I'd love to hear from you of how you think about kind of not just bridging the time efficiency, but even the cost efficiency for making the data usable, given the focus of Centaur Labs.
Yeah, well, when you're talking about a 6 to 9 month turnaround time, I think one thing, for what it's worth, where people underestimate costs most dramatically is the overhead and the management of, you've got all these smart people at your pharma company or whatever it is who are, going back and forth over email or twiddling their thumbs for those 6 or 9 months. So if you can reduce that amount of time by a couple months, it's not just the cost that you're paying for the data or the cost you're paying to annotate the data, it's the overhead internally. And I think that's where we see teams underestimate costs the most. In terms of the speed, I think a lot of it is, annotating data is a slow and grueling process if you're not working with us. So if you're working on annotating data, you should come talk to us about speeding up the timelines there. But annotating data, once you've got something relatively structured, okay, I've got a bunch of images and I've got a bunch of reports and I want to extract all the key findings from the reports and draw on the images, something like that. That's something we can do very quickly. But to Dan's point on, a lot of it is actually harmonizing and normalizing the data. So sometimes for us, people think of annotation as, okay, I want to draw shapes on images, let's say. Oftentimes we're seeing things where our clients come to us and they say, we've just got all this data, but it's from 30 different places, and I need to normalize the data. So our tasks are sometimes just things like, hey, is COV the same as COVID-19? And is that the same as, the coronavirus from, 2019? To just normalize the data and figure out what you have. And if you don't do those steps, I mean, it's garbage in, garbage out. So that's where I think there's the biggest uncertainty. It's that step in between getting data or working with a partner to access data, and before the annotation step, actually, of just figuring out how to combine disparate data sets. And as we're getting increasingly multimodal and increasingly focused on longitudinal data, that gets even more complicated, because now you've got, it's like it's an exponential thing where you've taken some problem that might be n difficulty, and now you've made it n factorial difficulty, because now you've got all these different combinations of data sets on different patients from different sites, and you're trying to capture the longitudinal history. So I'd say, to summarize, people underestimate the internal costs of working with all these vendors and getting the value out of their data in terms of time, and probably overestimate the cost of buying data and the cost of annotating it. And most of the time is not, it's not the grueling work of annotating. It's not the picking a vendor to figure out what data you want to buy. It's actually then taking stock of how you're going to combine disparate data sets and figure out what did I just buy, and how am I going to derive insights from it.
That's a fantastic kind of insight into how the utility of the data kind of impacts the buying decision, and more importantly, how that buying decision translates to how fast you can kind of demonstrate the hypotheses with the FDA or the European Union or so on. So digging a little bit deeper, I'd love to get some commentary from the rest of the panel. Stella, I'm looking at you and at Omni, and would love to understand, when you think of the complexity of multimodal data and how fast your customers can use it, do you have a perspective on whether it is therapeutic area dependent? Meaning, if oncology generally tends to be exponentially more expensive because of the need for both prospective and retrospective insights and endpoints that you need to access, compared to, say, orthopedics, which is more surgically driven kind of insights and outcomes. So would love to hear how the quality of the data, once the buying decision has been made, is kind of translated into utility that's therapeutic area specific. We have over 1,000 people on the call. I'm sure some of them represent, oncology, neurology, orthopedics, cardio, etc. So would love to get the perspective of where the focus is, and how do you guys mitigate those focuses for the industry? You're in mute, Stella.
Apologies. Absolutely, when we're sort of considering how to put forward multimodal data, it is very therapeutic area specific, because the key insights that you want to derive for any disease will require different inputs. For example, in oncology, you're looking at disease progression more in terms of markers, biomarkers. Perhaps imaging comes into play, but it could be less so than if we were to talk about ophthalmology, for example. And all of that also goes back to, how are the data captured in the first place? And and at Omni, we always think about that, because that is very critical in terms of how, what does an HCP need to convey a decision, and to assess a patient, and how are they going to record that into the data? Because all of that is going to flow into the output that we care about, which is research readiness and also regulatory acceptability. So the way that we go about that is that you do not have a one size fits all approach to RWD. Back when the core source of RWD was claims data, you can kind of do that, but as we all recognize today, that's very broad, but it's also very shallow in terms of how you understand patients on a certain therapy. So so what we're doing at Omni, and I suspect all my colleagues here are doing, is that we do take a very specific approach to curation. For us, that starts with, where do we even source the data in the first place? So with oncology, sure, you can find patients in general hospitals, but perhaps it's a whole lot. You're going to yield more if you go to if you're sourcing from a cancer center. There are certain therapeutic areas, such as ophthalmology, where a large hospital system may not be the most appropriate place find your patient population who have the outcomes and the markers that you're interested in. So I think a lot of that really does start with sourcing the data in the first place. And then, with that, you do have to layer on not just the insights and the expertise of data scientists, but also those clinicians that are, very, very, deep and day to day working within those therapies. And they're really the ones who guide us in terms of, how do we curate those key data points.
Fantastic. So one of the key points I was noting down as you were speaking, Stella, was the market expectation is very quickly going to shift from access to demonstrating evidence and answering questions behind their licensing agreements. So would love to hear from Alice and then Jay to see what are your organizations doing to not only provide the raw material to the buyers, but actually leading them to refining, in using Eric's word, how that evidence can be demonstrated using your data. Because the biggest challenge in pharma companies right now, that even if they have access to data, that they still cannot answer the questions that are at hand. In one of my conversations with a pharma company 48 hours ago, I was asked a very simple question, which was the same question we were all trying to answer almost 15, 20 years ago. Is like, well, I'm just trying to understand drug switches. Is why are people switching from my drug? And I'm like, did we try and answer this in 1998? Why are we still stuck on the same question? So would love to hear from you, Alice, to see that, how is Curimeta kind of translating the expectations in the market to say, yes, access, it's not 100% solved, but we're pretty close to solving it. But how do you go from access to evidence as kind of the key differentiator in the industry?
Right. So I think part of that ends up coming when Dan was talking about starting with feasibility. Some of this, we are presented with a request or a use case. And one of the first things we do is we really go through and see, does that data exist in a form that they need or want? And in some cases, maybe they're asking for a very specific clinical disease activity index. Maybe it's not used at the organization. So to go back and to say, are there other types of ways that you need or want to be able to measure or evaluate the severity of disease? So there's a bit of dialogue there, because we all come in, I believe, in some cases with a bit of that particular lens based on how we've seen documentation done before, how severity of illness, how progression of disease is documented. And then in addition, in some cases, somebody might say, we're really interested in acquiring EKG waveforms. And as we're going through that, we very quickly learn that the waveforms themselves, the digitized waveforms, are not available within our data contributor. They're actually sitting within the actual device vendor. So that creates an additional complexity that the life sciences company or their researchers may not have been aware of before, and we also discover. So there's a bit of this co-learning journey where we say, this is the current data environment. These are some of the challenges that we have. Is there a way that we could, is there flexibility within your protocol or your request to adapt to that? Do we need to look to other places for that? Another example that comes to mind within clinical documentation is migraine and using Botox injections for migraine relief. One might think, well, this should be something that's in a flow sheet or very easy to see the locations and the units injected in each of those locations. We might actually find that it's not in a structured field. It is a form that somebody is kind of drawing on and then scanning back. So then you have additionally, if you need that information, how can we extract that? Is this going to be a manual curation and review and beyond? So I think there's a lot of collaboration and learning and a flexibility that ends up, it's an invitation in this whole process. And it may differ, from our data contributors to other data contributors, which further makes this a more complex question.
Thank you,
Janet,
Alice.
this is an interesting point, because this is actually why the data prep or the data feasibility takes so long. It's not just about accessing the data, it's getting the data to a point that you could actually run the study, which is when the epi biostats actually kind of run the study, and then whether it's a burn disease, natural history, comparative effectiveness, all the data prep takes a lot longer than people kind of realize. And plus, I mean, we do a lot of private research network in Europe, and you have different languages, different countries, different code structures. There's just many complexities before you can actually run the study. But it's also a competitive advantage, since it's people need country specific and disease specific data.
Fantastic, thank you. And lastly, Jay, any commentary?
Yeah, I just want to add a comment on what Alice just said. As we experience the same thing when we work with clients. We need to work with them together on the feasibility study. We often want something that actually does not exist in the real world setting, and we have to work with them to get the wrong solution for them. So that's what I think two things are pretty important. One is the completeness of the records. So if you cannot find this information in the medical EHR, whether you can find some information in the medical imaging, whether this data can actually answer your question differently than your original request. Another one is that since we are working with many different vendors and data contributors, healthcare providers, and because our partner, our customer, they want data from different locations, and sometimes they have very strict inclusion and exclusion criteria. We have to get data from multiple locations. So the data consistency is also very important here to help them to make sure the data is not biased, the data is consistent and statistically making sense. So we are using a lot of large language model and also human help here to make sure data from different sources will convert to the same format so that it can be ready to use. And lastly, even once the data is ready to use, it needs some expert to analyze this data. So we actually are looking for collaborators as well in this space who can actually do additional analysis on top of the raw, not raw data, but processed data, and provide insights based on the data to the end users. So I think it requires people to work together to provide complete, consistent, and also meaningful results from the data.
So we heard some key data points is consistency, completeness, accuracy, and longitudinality of data access to be able to even answer those questions that are therapeutic area specific. No, thank you, Jay. I'd like to kind of double click on one of the comments that Dan mentioned, saying that the level of complexity associated with actually running validation studies or even demonstrating evidence behind foundational questions is a fairly large level of effort across any pipeline. So I'm curious, is the expectation from the pharma and the biotech companies shifting to where the industry used to be 20 years ago, where they would buy less data but ask more questions and wait for the questions to be answered to include the hypotheses in their arguments? And is that a sustainable trend given the level of investments that has gone into building data infrastructures, data networks, and data companies? And does that translate into the pharma companies wanting less data, but more aggregation values and more aggregate evidence-based Q&A type of engagements looking into the future? I've been in 2 conversations with CROs who have indicated saying, I don't really need access to 100 million patients. I just want to answer the question for these 1,000 patients and whether or not they will respond in an appropriate way on the therapy that we are targeting for. So I'm, given Dan kind of led into that, I'd love to hear the commentary from you, Dan, of are we going back to the world of HEOR and the Truans and the IMSs of the world, or is the need for data accessibility still going to be sustaining 5 years, 6 years out?
Well, I think it's a complex world where it depends on where you're fitting within the pharma or medical device kind of ecosystem, which is, are you working with specific therapeutic areas that have research questions to move their products along? Or are you doing more generative AI work that you basically are needing larger data sets? So it really just depends on, is it translational medicine where you're doing biomarker discovery and you need larger data sets? Or is it in doing new diagnostics, which is where a lot of the imaging comes into? Or is it in actually research questions where they need evidence for regulatory, payers, and clinicians changing clinical practice? In that state, probably less data is more because they actually have deeper questions, versus in doing biomarker discovery, you need more data. So it really just depends.
Okay. Stella, I'm familiar with some of your clients. I'd love to hear from you to see if OMNY is shifting its strategy from just pure access and licensing to evidence generation.
So I would say that it's not so much a shift, but an expansion. And to kind of sort of double down on what Dan said and what you were mentioning earlier, Janet, I think that we are we're sort of, as an industry, broadening our expectations, and or maybe even shifting away from scale to grade and to quality. And we can do that because we actually do have the variety of data now to be able to do that. So it's not just everything is the same claims data set, everything's coming from the same EHR source, and we just need bigger and bigger. And I think all of that kind of plays into the OMNY business model as well, because at our core, we will always put forward RWD. We want to put forward quality data. We do want to put forward data at enough scale so that you can realistically run studies, even on rare diseases. But having said that, and to all the comments that have already been made, not everybody needs to have data in their own four walls in order to do something with that. And so that's where we do have our internal expertise and resources, whether they're clinical, whether they're more on the research side or data science side, to to guide users all the way to the point of handing them results. In addition to that, I think what's sort of important to us at OMNY, in order to make that data and the insights accessible, is to build out services that we haven't really thought about historically with RWD, because we didn't have that luxury. And so that includes custom curation, which to varying degrees all of my colleagues here are doing. Because the reality is that as patients and providers, when we look at an electronic health record, it looks very complete, from our perspective, and standing in those shoes, and it looks like everything might even be interoperable. But when you lift those covers and you look at the underlying data from a research lens, it turns out that it is not. Like Alice said, you can have images, you see it as a patient and provider, but that data is sitting with the with the imaging manufacturer. And so what that entails is, as as an offering to our life sciences clients and other research clients, we do need to build up that service to say, here are the 80% of data that we know everybody needs, and we've already pre-curated, cleaned, and everything. So, here are the 20% that one entity needs once a year. So that that it really does not behoove anybody for us to spend the resources and time and focus on that. In addition to that, there's always going to be those questions that there are no data that exists. And reasons for that include they're really measures that are only collected during clinical trial, not in real world practice. It could be that they're just measures that nobody really thinks to ask. And that's where at OMNY, because of our direct contractual relationships and our partnerships with healthcare organizations, we can sort of flip that paradigm into recruiting our organizations as as sites to to collect data prospectively, whether that's observational all the way to recruitment into clinical trials.
Fantastic, thank you. And Eric, would love to kind of hear a brief comment from you before we go into the Q&A session from our listeners. Are the type of questions and engagements you're getting piggybacking more on answering specific questions based on the effort that Central Labs is pursuing? Or are the questions more generic to say, hey, I'd like to label, tag, group, and associated terminology to a broad data set? I'd love to kind of get a perspective on what is the level of sophistication, maturity, and specificity with which you're getting these questions.
Yeah, it varies, which is actually one of the more challenging parts of our business. I mean, we've heard some of this from Alice and Jay also about there's this back and forth collaborative effort. Sometimes we have clients come to us and they know immediately what they want. They say, I want all the drug names extracted from all these clinical notes, or I want all the symptoms and drugs related to each other, something like that. It's very straightforward. They're maybe already doing it and they just need to scale the operation. Probably more frequently is, especially with the pharma clients, as opposed to like the AI native disruptors, the pharma clients come to us more with a high level problem. So they might say, I'm trying to use large language models to identify adverse events in clinical notes, or I'm trying to do better phenotyping. I've got all this omics data. I've got all these notes. How do I find new things that might be, not structured fields? In which case we have much more of a back and forth with them, where we think about how we can, accomplish the goal that they have given the data sets that they have. So it's highly variable, but I'd say especially in pharma, they might come with a goal. They haven't thought very narrowly about how they're going to accomplish some sort of annotation project or curation project. And then we can help sort of guide them in the right direction once we understand their goals.
Fantastic, thank you. I do want to switch to audience Q&A. We are about 10 minutes away from the end of the session. I was following the pattern of some of the commentary being made, and one of the comments made by Shivang Bhagat actually touches on one of the most important questions, especially in the US, which is how do we demonstrate heterogeneity in the data assets and heterogeneity as defined by race, ethnicity, gender orientation, etc. My colleagues in FDA just published a draft guidance on a document which is identified as diversity action plans for clinical trial recruitment. So I'm curious, how do we meet the expectations of my colleagues in Washington, D.C., and how do we get to a diversity action plan as represented by a variety of different race and ethnicity representation in the RWE dataset? So Jay, would love to hear from you on how you guys are working globally, given Segmed is in Southeast Asia, it's in Europe and in the United States, of addressing that question. And maybe after you, we can go to Alice.
This is very, very good questions. Actually, many of our clients come to us saying, hey, I have collaboration with 2 hospitals in New York, in California, but I don't have any representing population in the Midwest or in the South. Can you help us with that? So this is actually very common for us. And since starting day one, our data partner strategy is that we want to work with all sides of partners, all locations, because we believe that for when we developing AI algorithm, when we developing any new treatment for the patients, it need to be unbiased. It need to be solving this issue. So this has been very important for us from day one. So we try to include all locations possible. And for example, sometimes when people asking questions, can we get some data from China for Chinese population or for East Asian population? The answer is you probably cannot get it from Chinese population from China directly, but you can get maybe data from Japanese, from Taiwanese, and maybe from other countries that can help showcase that the data is balanced and is including all populations you need for demo the use case to the FDA. Yeah, so we work with all partners in Taiwan, in Asia, in the US for these questions. And also, we start to working with some other data partners who actually provide patient demographic information specifically, so that they can capture more information. Because sometimes in radiology setting, the race and the ethnicity are not always collected during the treatment process, but they are collected somewhere else. So we need to do the tokenization and try to overlap the patient cohort to make sure we can provide them this information.
Fantastic. And Alice, double clicking on what Jay indicated, would love to hear how CuraMeta is addressing the heterogeneity need for race and ethnicity representation, or at least underrepresented populations in RWE-led trials. And adding to a level of complexity there, especially if you're dealing with aggregating data from outside the United States, or rather, how are you guys addressing the burden of governance and audit reporting, given the different regulations and legal requirements behind it?
Yeah. So first, when we're looking at anything related to race and ethnicity, the reality is that, and that was great lead in, and I appreciate that, it's not necessarily well captured at all in the EHR data. And that is very much, even a lot of this is self-reported. So for example, I moved to Houston, and as I was establishing care, I had the option to opt out of providing any of that information. So we do have that on a specific subset of our patients. I don't know the percentage off the top of my head. That certainly is going to be a limitation in you coming to us and saying, I want a comprehensive look at your entire patient population stratified out, because we will have a certain segment that there will be no values recorded for that. So that's one challenge. I think that the reality of trying to address that means that we collaboratively across multiple industries need to do a lot of essentially reparation work. We're talking about populations that have either been ignored or suffered harm societally within healthcare. So how can we do that? We need to partner with some grassroots efforts within those communities. We need to be very transparent about what our aims are, as well as making sure that we are essentially, if we're looking to develop new interventions, are those interventions going to be accessible into those communities? Because if they aren't, then we're essentially reestablishing this, you are good for research, but we're not going to actually impact your health. So that goes a little bit off of maybe the full scope of the question, but I think that it really does go beyond what we individually as organizations can do to move to shift that. As far as like provenance and data quality, I mean, we track all of that very specifically. And that is traceable. That is one of the absolute areas of focus that we have. We are focused on quality rather than trying to throw as much data out there as possible, which is one of the reasons. And it's necessitated by the very complex, specific inclusion-exclusion criteria and needs that a lot of our companies are coming to us with, our prospects. And increasingly, we are seeing this conversation about ensuring that we're understanding the differences from racial and ethnicity differences as well.
I mean, this is a very complex problem. In Europe, you can't even ask the question of ethnicity or race, but you can use geographic kind of where they are within a community, where they are in a kind of what care are they going to. There are certain hospitals that have larger African populations based on the way they're set up because they're public hospitals. In the US, you can do it similarly, which is where are people coming from? Washington Hospital obviously has a large African community. Traditionally, African hospitals or African American hospitals will have larger patient populations. If you have pathology samples, you could actually do a chromosomal match and actually get absolute ethnicity rather than self-reported, but obviously that would be very hard to do, but an interesting creative strategy.
We also see I mean, this doesn't apply in too many areas, but we do a lot of work in the dermatology space or in other areas where maybe there's videos of patients with, having a conversation with a doctor in a mental health setting or a telemedicine setting. And something we see clients ask us for quite a bit is to tag skin tone information on the data sets that they have. So, they'll say, hey, I'm making a psoriasis, drug, and I've got all these images of psoriasis, and I need to make sure I'm aware that dermatology has these biases and algorithms in the space, especially because a lot of the skin cancer data, for instance, it's all from Austria and Australia, and it's all white patients. So it's a known problem that these algorithms don't work as well on patients with dark skin. So in the dermatology space, everyone from pharma to even beauty companies that we work with that are building algorithms in the space, they've all asked us to tag data for either Fitzpatrick skin tone scale, or now there's Monk skin tone scale that Google utilizes, just so they can get a read on the diversity of their data and whether their algorithms or insights are vary based on skin tone. Now, that of course doesn't apply for a lot of radiology and other data, but at least in that space where it's possible to assess it, we see the majority of our clients asking for that information in addition to us tagging psoriasis severity or whatever it is.
It's interesting you bring up that dermatology example because we also have put forward a lot of dermatology data at OMNY, and one of the common complaints that we've heard from our dermatologists is that there is no easy place in most EHRs to note skin tone, even when they're using specialized EHRs that have like a picture of the body and you're clicking through to say here are where the psoriasis plaques are. And even though there are EHRs that are very specialized and capture really detailed severity measures for dermatology. And that kind of brings up also the point that the data that we get is only as good as the collection, as whatever is used to collect. So EHRs and really the clinical workflows that are built into it also drive a lot of the data quality, especially in the areas that we're talking about. But but skin tone is a really interesting one because we too have also put forward images to train AI in the detection and in understanding severity of psoriasis and other conditions. And what we find there is that the variations that you find not just in skin tone but just the environment as these images are taken in the real world is quite a departure from the original training that may have been done within a strict clinical trial.
Fantastic. I know we are right about at time, but I would love a lightning round, no more than 30 seconds. Opportunities and challenges on RWE. Stella, if we can start with you, how do you see what's in your crystal ball for the next 2-3 years?
Sure. I think one challenge that we didn't really have time to touch on is the whole idea of patient de-identification. One of the reasons why RWD is so accessible is because we de-identified so everybody can confidently use this data. And so I do see that as a major challenge, especially let's just take the U.S. for example. HIPAA came about at a time where we were not contemplating the scope of data that we have and that we have the technology to consume. We've mentioned a lot of them just in this in this panel. So I do see that as a challenge that we must address. In terms of opportunity, the breadth of data, the depth of data just expands, and also coming to adding to that is the most other important component, which is we have the technology to consume that data and to actually analyze it and extract insights. So I think it's incumbent for all of us on the curation side to to always kind of meet the data with the technology, and only doing so do we make that data really truly accessible.
Thank you. Jay, 30 seconds.
Yeah, I think one thing we didn't discuss, and I think there's also a lot of challenge and also opportunity, is that how we combine different data types together. Every department within the healthcare provider, they work differently, they format it different. how they classify the patients different. So it's a challenge, but also a lot of opportunities to use AI or to use even human creation for this purpose. But it's a must thing to do if we want to get some value out of the multimodal data set.
Eric?
Well, you mentioned in the beginning, there's, how much easier it is to access data than it was 5 or 10 years ago. That exponential trend is going to continue. A lot of the folks on the call today are working on aggregating data sets and combining them, like at Segmed, from hospitals all around the world for researchers to use. Many of those companies are going to start combining data sets outside of radiology, and more hospitals, they're going to get more and more aggregated. And, you've got 30% plus of the world's data is healthcare data. You've got ChatGPT trained on basically the world's internet data, which maybe it's 60% of the world's data. There's this huge unlocked resource, and I think you're going to see that exponential trend you were talking about continue to accelerate, and there's going to be something more like Google organizing the world's information, but with a massive, massive amount of multimodal healthcare data and algorithms built on top of that are going to be really powerful. Even though it's much more accessible and diverse today than it was 10 years ago, that trend's going to continue, and healthcare data is going to be far less siloed than it was 10, 20 years ago. And that opens up a lot of opportunity in the AI age.
Fantastic. Alice?
Some of the great challenges that I see ahead are the increasing utility of omics in general. We've already been seeing that in genomics, but we're talking about transcriptomics and beyond. So there's that tipping point from research into use at the point of care. Very excited about what that will bring. We will continue to see that variance and the challenges in discovering data within unstructured clinical documentation. So I think there always is opportunity for various machine learning, natural language processing models that really require that they are built with, and there is a transparency in how they work. So there's a whole provenance and data quality related to that.
Fantastic. And Dan?
Yeah, I guess the biggest thing I need everybody here to do, which is building evidence, publishing, whether it's white papers, whether it's to validate what you're doing, how you're doing it, the data, the process, because we need to educate pharma device diagnostics on what is possible, and that things are validated well, you can work through it, and that you're actually driving to evidence.
Fantastic. Thank you all for the panel. But before that, I'll give you my kind of 30 seconds of crystal ball. I would say the opportunity where I see is definitely in expanding the heterogeneity of RWE data assets, both in the US and international. And the data coming from the Middle East, the data coming from Southeast Asia is emerging to be very interesting for the sponsors. Number two, I would say for those organizations trying to focus on RWE-led companies, focus on novel data assets to differentiate the pure access argument. What data and exclusivity behind that data access you have that others don't? Is it calibration data? Is it instrument data? Is it workflow specific data that can be normalized across different institutions? Is it patient reported outcomes from specific target populations, et cetera? So focusing on novel data is going to be very important. And lastly, I would say, let's stop as an industry replicating on commodity tools. I don't think the industry needs another kind of analytical tool to look at a claims data when we already have, I did some research about 1,400 analytical tools in the RWE space. We don't need 1,401st tools. So I think the level of maturity in the industry is pretty high, that there is a level of replicability and reusability in the tools that are available in the market. So more collaborations and more partnerships would actually be helpful in the industry rather than further fragmenting the tooling side of the equation. But with that, thank you all for the fantastic, very engaging and high energy panel. And thank you for all the listeners on this call.